Eliza Stevens had never considered herself the type to attract conflict. She lived quietly, minding her own business, on the southern edge of a town that had just enough charm left to still feel separate from the messier sprawl of the nearby city. Her property was an old one, a little crooked in places, patched in others, but functional, grounded, and personal. It had once belonged to her great-aunt, who had left it to Eliza with a single, dry warning in her will. Don't let anyone tell you what can or can't grow on your land. Eliza had taken the advice to heart, not in a combative way, but more as a guiding principle. She was self-reliant by temperament and practice, not ideology. Her days were filled with quiet routines that suited her. Long walks around the edge of the property line, caring for her modest garden, and tending to the half-dozen hens she kept in a shaded, well-maintained coop just behind the house. She didn't consider them pets, but they were more than just livestock. They laid eggs, of course, but they also marked the rhythm of her mornings, their soft clucking providing a counterpoint to the buzz of the world outside. For a while, the world had left her alone, and she had been glad for that. Then Karen Bexley moved in next door. From the moment the movers rolled up and the slate-colored SUV with tinted windows turned into the driveway, Eliza had sensed a shift in the balance of the neighborhood. Not a dramatic one, not at first, but something in the way Karen had stepped out of the vehicle, pausing before she even approached the house to make a phone call, pacing deliberately in her pressed white shirt and narrow sunglasses, had registered with Eliza. It was a kind of practiced certainty, the posture of someone who expected the world to fold itself neatly around her preferences. The house Karen purchased had sat vacant for almost a year following a foreclosure, its yard overgrown and hedges gone wild. Eliza had often worried the town would come down on her for it, thinking she'd somehow been responsible for its condition, since it bordered hers and the wild vines had begun to stretch across the fence. But nothing had happened. The silence was its own blessing. Now, in under a week, Karen had stripped the entire yard clean of every root and stone, trucked in sterilized topsoil, and had 3 uniformed landscaping men measure and install a roll-out sod lawn so precise it looked vacuum-sealed. Not a week later, garden flags appeared, matching stonework along the driveway was laid down, and a laminated pamphlet marked Community Standards Unified Aesthetic had shown up in Eliza's mailbox. There was no signature, just a note in block letters. Worth reviewing for the good of the street. Eliza ignored it. She didn't grow roses in spirals or mow on a schedule that aligned with the kind of suburban rituals Karen seemed to crave, but she didn't believe she had to. Her chickens were confined to her own land, her compost was sealed and properly turned, and her fencing was intact. The property was old, but not dilapidated, and the coop had recently passed county inspection. She had all the papers and receipts tucked away in a folder, the corners worn from use. Eliza had never been cited for a violation, not even when the previous owners had reported her for letting her grass grow too tall during a heat wave. This was not her first neighbor with opinions, but it was her first neighbor with the appetite and bandwidth to act on them with what seemed like professional obsession. The first complaint was silent. Eliza only knew it had been made because an unmarked county vehicle arrived late one Tuesday afternoon, pausing briefly near the curb before slowly rolling forward toward her driveway. A man in a short-sleeved shirt with a clipboard stepped out, politely asked if she was Eliza Stevens, and then handed her a printed notice. Formal documentation of a preliminary investigation into possible environmental non-compliance involving avian activity on private land. The language was vague, intentionally so. But Eliza knew what it meant. She'd been reported. The county worker wasn't accusatory. If anything, he seemed mildly embarrassed, going through the required questions, inspecting the area briefly, nodding approvingly when she showed him the sanitized feeder bins, the clean coop with enclosed wire, mesh, and the fully shaded run. He left without issuing a citation but reminded her that the complaint remains on file and that further reports may trigger formal evaluation. Eliza watched him leave, a slow, growing pressure forming at the back of her skull. Not fear, not even anger exactly, but something colder. Resentment. She looked across the yard. Karen was watering her newly installed hydrangeas with a wand nozzle. She wore the same sunglasses as always, and her expression, even from a distance, seemed engineered to appear serene. Karen didn't look over once, but Eliza knew she'd seen the county car, and somehow she also knew it was only the beginning. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a game Eliza didn't know she'd entered. New lawn signs appeared along Karen's fence line with phrases like healthy air, healthy streets, positioned just enough to be read from Eliza's window. Bright orange pest control flags were placed every 5 feet along the grass border between their properties, though the chemicals used were unlisted. One morning, a row of potted shrubs appeared on Karen's side of the boundary line, each placed just high enough to partially obstruct the view of Eliza's coop. The unspoken message was clear. You're tolerated, but you don't belong. Eliza remained composed. She didn't take photos, didn't post on forums or call friends to complain. She reread her documentation, updated her records, and quietly renewed her poultry license with the county. She started keeping a log of her chickens' feeding and cleaning schedule. Not for herself, but for whoever might come next, clipboard in hand, ready to catch her off guard. Still, the unease grew, not because Karen was aggressive in the usual sense. There were no confrontations, no shouted words over fences, just the slow drip of calculated pressure, the kind that told Eliza she was being measured against a standard someone else had invented without her consent. And then, one morning, she found a second county notice in her mailbox, this time not hand-delivered. It cited a probable cause complaint about unsanitary animal waste runoff, and stated that a formal site inspection would occur in 10 days. No details were given, but the language was sharper. There would be testing. Failure to comply could result in fines. The wording was dry, bureaucratic, but she could feel the trap being set. It wasn't just about the chickens. It was about control. She looked at her hens, calm and pecking gently at the ground, and something in her hardened. She knew she couldn't respond emotionally, couldn't lash out or confront Karen directly. That's what people like Karen wanted, to draw you into their arena, where rules shifted with the tone of their voice. Eliza needed a different approach. She had to work within the same system Karen used, cold, procedural, and thorough. But she would do it her way. Later that afternoon, while walking along the property line, Eliza noticed something odd. A sour, slightly chemical smell wafted from Karen's yard, most noticeable near the northeast corner where the slope of the lawn funneled runoff toward the shared drainage trench. The odor wasn't sewage or fertilizer. It was sharper, synthetic, and that's when something clicked. Eliza knelt and touched the soil along the dividing fence. It was unusually damp, even though it hadn't rained in 5 days. The earth crumbled in her hand, but left a faint residue, gritty and bitter-smelling. She stood slowly, wiping her fingers on her jeans, her mind already turning. If Karen wanted a technical war, then maybe it was time to look a little closer at the ground she was standing on. The hens clucked quietly in the background as Eliza walked back toward the house. Her pace was steady. There was no rush. 10 days was more than enough. Eliza didn't waste time on speculation or outrage. After years of navigating bureaucratic nonsense in her previous work, before she left city life behind, she had learned one thing above all else. Assumptions are expensive, and emotion is inefficient. The moment she received the second notice from the county, she put on her reading glasses, sat down at the kitchen table, and began dissecting every sentence. The wording was more aggressive this time, more formal and threatening. Probable cause, it read, has been established regarding potential non-compliant animal waste practices resulting in environmental seepage and public health concern. The date of the pending inspection was underlined and bolded. 10 days. Not business days. 10 calendar days. She closed the letter slowly and sat in silence for a moment, her hands folded neatly on top of it. The county didn't escalate that quickly unless something, or someone, was persistently prodding them. She hadn't received a warning citation, no step-by-step outline of violations, just 2 visits within a month and now a formal threat of enforcement. Something was forcing the issue. Someone. Eliza didn't need to see Karen's signature on the complaint to understand it was her doing. The calculated, passive-aggressive escalation of the situation bore Karen's fingerprints in every detail. The flags, the veiled pamphlets, the chemical-loaded lawn. And if Karen was smart enough to keep her name off official paperwork, Eliza would need to be smarter. Because this wasn't just about hens anymore. It was about pushing her off balance, testing how long she would last before yielding to pressure that wasn't technically illegal, but was designed to overwhelm and discredit. She took action the same day. After making a call to the local agricultural extension office, she drove into town and requested a formal evaluation of her coop and yard under the Municipal Livestock Code. The man behind the desk, gray-haired, cautious, polite, told her that most people didn't voluntarily ask for inspections. She told him quietly, "I prefer the truth to surprise fines." He nodded and scheduled the visit within 3 days. Next, she went to the hardware store and bought soil test kits. Not for defense, but for data. If someone was going to accuse her of runoff or contamination, she wanted to be able to verify what was in her ground and what wasn't. Back home, she took samples from 5 points around her property. Near the compost bins, the base of the coop, the slight dip in the yard where water collected during storms, and 2 control spots away from the chickens. She logged the sample times, dates, locations, and took photos. Not because she thought it would be needed, but because Karen had already proven she played the long game, and Eliza intended to meet her on the same field. By the time the county livestock agent arrived, Eliza was ready. He was a younger man, efficient and respectful, wearing county-issue khakis and a windbreaker, clipboard in hand. He walked the property with her, asked questions, took photos of the co-op, inspected the feed containers, and complimented her on the cleanliness and layout of the enclosure. She handed him a file folder with her poultry permit, vaccination records, and photographs of the cleaning schedule pinned inside the coop wall. The man gave a small smile and said, "I've seen a lot worse. Honestly, this looks fine." But when she asked whether that would be reflected in the upcoming inspection, he hesitated. "Depends who shows up. Some of them are stricter. But I'll log this visit, and if your records match the permit file, you should be in the clear." It wasn't a promise, but it was something. 3 days later, Eliza was out by her garden just after sunrise, pulling up early weeds when she heard the sound of tires crunching slowly over gravel. Not her driveway. Karen's. She didn't look up at first, but something about the rhythm of the engine idling, shutting off, and the door closing with unnatural gentleness made her turn. A woman in a business-casual blouse and slacks stepped out, mid-30s, angular, holding a heavy black tablet. She walked up to Karen's house and knocked. Karen opened the door dressed as if she were hosting a church social. Floral blouse, cream pants, hair pinned and sprayed to perfection. The 2 women spoke briefly. Karen gestured toward the back of her property. The inspector nodded and walked down the side of the house. Karen stayed behind, arms crossed loosely in a posture that could be mistaken for casual interest. Eliza narrowed her eyes and wiped her hands on her jeans. She moved toward the side gate of her own property, keeping a measured pace. If the county was walking the shared property line, she was going to watch them do it. Sure enough, the inspector didn't stop at Karen's fence. She walked right down to the trench where the lawns met, paused, and looked down, stylus tapping the side of her tablet. Eliza kept her expression blank as she walked closer. The woman looked up, her face neutral but not unfriendly. "You must be Ms." Aku, Stevens. I am. Just doing preliminary measurements on the shared drainage boundary. We've had 2 filings connected to this section. 2? The woman nodded. 1 anonymous, 1 formal. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Eliza nodded slowly. You're welcome to take whatever readings you need, but I'll ask for a record of what you log here today. You'll receive a summary report if there's a formal citation. That's not what I asked. The woman met her gaze. After a pause, she nodded once. I'll make a note to include you in the reporting line. Eliza stepped back and let the woman work. She didn't hover. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The smell was present again. Faint, but sharper today. The soil near the trench hadn't dried since the last rain, and it shouldn't have still been saturated. The inspector used a small probe, inserted it into the ground, recorded data, and moved down the line. She didn't say anything to Karen, who remained posted silently near her door. After 15 minutes, she returned to her vehicle, typing into the tablet as she walked. The engine started, and the car pulled away. That night, Eliza opened her own soil test results. The samples she'd taken all showed within expected levels for nitrogen, ammonia, phosphates. Nothing excessive, nothing dangerous, which meant if anything toxic was in that trench, it wasn't coming from her side of the fence. She scanned and saved the results, then made 2 printed copies. 1 went into her file. The other would be delivered to the Environmental Compliance Office the next morning. But what happened next surprised even her. 2 days later, Eliza received an email. Not a letter, not a visit. It was from the county's Environmental Division, terse, factual, and addressed jointly to her and Karen Bexley. It stated that soil samples collected from the boundary drainage zone had returned results inconsistent with residential fertilizer or waste runoff. The contaminants detected included a high concentration of non-biodegradable surfactants and residual herbicidal chemicals banned from residential application without commercial permit. The tone wasn't accusatory, but it was clear. A more thorough investigation would follow. Eliza read the email 3 times, slowly, her pulse steadying with each pass. She looked out the window. Karen was walking the edge of her yard, phone in hand, face pinched, scanning the lawn as if it might betray her. For the first time, Eliza allowed herself a quiet thought. Not vengeful, not gleeful, just a recognition of balance. You pushed, and the ground pushed back. But she knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. Eliza wasn't either. The morning after the email arrived, Eliza made coffee in complete silence. Not because she was distracted, and not because anything felt ominous in the air, but because there was a new kind of weight in her kitchen. A waiting sort of pressure, like the moment before an incoming storm breaks, when the wind stops just long. Enough to make your instincts shift. She didn't need to check her inbox again. She already knew that nothing more would come that day. The county's response had cracked something open, but it would move slow, maybe even stall. And she understood now that the real maneuvering was going to happen in the space between the emails. Those days when nobody said anything, but everything was still happening. She glanced toward the window overlooking her backyard, where the coop stood quietly in the shade of the old cedar tree. The hens were already moving about, rustling softly. The soil around the trench, however, was still damp, and the faint chemical smell had deepened. That afternoon, she drove into town and stopped at the county records office. Not because she had an appointment, but because she knew it was the kind of place where things didn't happen unless someone showed up in person and asked for them. She stood patiently in line, filled out a request form, and asked to see all environmental complaints filed within her zoning area over the last 90 days. The clerk, a soft-voiced woman with faded lipstick and an allergy to direct eye contact, hesitated at first, then slid her a clipboard and gestured toward the waiting bench. "We'll call you when they're ready." It took nearly 2 hours. Eliza sat, watched people come and go, and made notes in her small spiral-bound notebook without looking busy. When her name was called, she was handed a manila envelope. Inside were 8 documents. Most routine, one redacted with thick black lines and one that caught her attention immediately. It listed her property by parcel number and stated that multiple anonymous tips had been submitted alleging potential groundwater contamination originating from her address. The exact phrasing was familiar. It matched the wording of the formal citation she had received. And while the complaint didn't name Karen directly, it used directional references. Adjacent southern parcel, shared runoff channel with eastern elevation. That only made sense from Karen's perspective. Eliza took the envelope home, scanned every document, saved them in a secure folder, and printed copies for physical backup. She labeled each file by date and cross-referenced it with her inspection notes. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because her mind was working in overdrive, pulling threads and timelines and interactions into a clearer picture. Karen had escalated, again, and this time she'd pushed into a space where Eliza no longer had the option of quiet defense. It was still a proxy war, but the gloves had come off. At 6 a.m., she opened her laptop and wrote a formal request for status clarification to the Environmental Review Board. She phrased it not as a complaint, but as a transparency request. Given that a parcel adjacent to mine has recently been implicated in an active investigation involving controlled substances in residential use, I would like clarity on any cross-implication risks noted in your testing. The wording was careful, not accusatory. She attached the scan of her own clean soil test and a copy of the livestock inspection report. The message was clear. I know what you're doing, and I am 3 steps ahead. But Karen, for all her controlling nature, was not stupid. She pivoted. The next phase didn't come in the form of more complaints, but through appearances. Within a week, Eliza noticed subtle, calculated changes. The traffic near Karen's house increased. Not guests or family, but professionals. 2 visits from a landscaping crew that didn't seem to be doing anything but walking the property with clipboards. A pair of women who stayed for 3 hours and took photographs of the lawn from various angles. A city contractor who arrived in an unmarked van and left behind a small, solar-powered box staked into the ground near the trench. Eliza made no effort to hide her observations. She walked her own perimeter every morning and evening, took photographs of everything visible from her side of the fence, and added them to her documentation folder. She didn't speak to Karen, and Karen didn't speak to her, but the silence between them now hummed with pressure, as if each woman was waiting for the other to blink. The blinking came, ironically, from someone else entirely. 2 properties down, a neighbor Eliza barely knew, a man named Curtis in his 60s, with a permanently grease-stained baseball cap and a voice that always seemed to be just recovering from the flu, stopped her at the curb one evening. He didn't say much, just tilted his head toward Karen's property and muttered, "You know she called the city on me last year for washing my car in the driveway?" Told him I was violating gray water disposal codes. He squinted toward the setting sun, then added, "I ain't washed it since." He didn't laugh, neither did she. But it was the first time anyone on the street had acknowledged what was happening aloud. And it was enough. Over the next few days, more quiet acknowledgments began to appear. A nod from the woman across the street as she watered her garden. A pause from the man who walked his dogs past her house every morning. Longer eye contact. More hesitations before. People waved to Karen. No one said anything directly, but Eliza recognized the shift. People were starting to see it, and that, apparently, was unacceptable to Karen. The next blow came swiftly, and this time it was personal. A certified letter, signature required, arrived at Eliza's door. Inside was a cease and desist order, not from Karen herself, but from a local attorney's office, claiming to represent her interests. The letter alleged that Eliza had deliberately and repeatedly harassed Karen, by initiating unsupported investigations, engaging in targeted surveillance, and disseminating inflammatory rumors. It threatened civil action, citing defamation and emotional distress. The accusations were exaggerated to the point of absurdity, but they weren't empty. Eliza read through the letter 3 times, then read it again, underlining key phrases. It wasn't a real lawsuit. It was a warning shot, an intimidation tactic designed to rattle her, to make her retreat. She didn't. Instead, she forwarded the letter to a small legal firm she had once worked with during her time in the city, people she trusted to understand not only the letter of the law, but how and when it was being used as a weapon. She didn't call them in a panic. She scheduled a consultation and provided her documentation in advance. When the paralegal followed up 2 days later, her tone was dry and calm. "We've reviewed the cease and desist. There's no actual substance behind the claims, but they were smart to phrase it the way they did. It's posturing, but strategic. We recommend sending a reply through counsel, factual, emotionless, and with our letterhead. Would you like us to handle it?" Eliza said yes. That night, for the first time since the tension had started, she slept deeply. 2 days later, she awoke to the sound of heavy machinery. Not construction, not a contractor. No, this was deeper, slower. A large vehicle rumbling just outside her fence line. She stepped outside, robe tied, hair unbrushed, and saw a municipal truck parked halfway on the shoulder in front of Karen's house. A man in reflective gear was removing the solar-powered box that had been planted near the trench. Another man was speaking with Karen at her doorstep. She wasn't yelling. She was nodding, slowly, expression hard to read. When they left, the box was gone. So was the tension in Karen's shoulders. And Eliza knew. Something hadn't gone her way. It wasn't the end. Not yet. But something had shifted. That evening, Eliza stood at the edge of her garden and stared at the corner where the trench disappeared behind the fence. She wasn't smiling. She didn't feel victorious. But she did feel something close to equilibrium, like the ground beneath her had stopped shifting for the first time in weeks. She knew better than to trust that feeling. Karen wouldn't give up easily. But she had blinked, just a little. And in that blink, Eliza saw her first opening. Not for revenge, not for dominance, for resolution on her terms. The air had shifted in recent days, not just in temperature but in tone. Eliza could feel it before she saw it. The morning sky was quieter, and the usual sound of Karen's meticulously timed sprinklers didn't hiss on at dawn as they had for weeks. The motion lights on the side of her neighbor's house that used to trigger suspiciously often at night now remained off, even during the twilight hours when Eliza walked her yard. Something was changing, though the surface of things appeared calm. Eliza didn't trust the silence. She knew Karen well enough by now to recognize that she wasn't the kind of person to accept inconvenience without retaliation. The legal warning hadn't succeeded. The removal of the county censor box had likely come as a blow. And still Karen had not made her next move. That meant she was planning. Eliza focused on her own steps instead. The reply letter from her legal counsel had been drafted, reviewed, and sent. It was concise, emotionless, and backed with documentation, logs, and clean inspection results. It carried weight, not because it was combative, but because it was firm. That formality seemed to have quieted Karen, but Eliza knew better than to think it was a true retreat. Still, the pause gave her room to maneuver. She used it. The first thing she did was contact the environmental office again, not to file a complaint, but to request a meeting with the field analyst who had initially handled the testing near the trench. She framed her request with professional courtesy and backed it with technical language. To her surprise, the analyst agreed. Eliza met her at the government annex 2 towns over, a squat building with concrete steps and faded signage. The analyst, a sharp, methodical woman in her 40s named Erin Marsh, didn't speak in generalities. She brought a folder with printed results, walked Eliza through the findings, and explained the timeline of follow-up actions. Aaron didn't offer opinions, only data. And the data painted a very clear picture. The chemical compounds found in the runoff trench were consistent with large-scale lawn treatment agents no longer sold in residential markets, surfactants used in commercial herbicide blends, residual signatures from industrial-strength inhibitors. None of these were legal for private use, and they had appeared not once but in all 3 samples taken along the runoff line at increasing concentration toward Karen's property line. Eliza asked carefully, "Does that mean the source is definitive?" Aaron raised an eyebrow. "It's not our job to speculate motive or intent, but we can map density and gradient, and the evidence aligns with southern to northern flow. From your direction, levels were normal to trace. From hers, elevated to saturated." She tapped the map again. "If this goes to enforcement, the county will likely require soil remediation. That's expensive, and the homeowner is financially responsible." Eliza nodded slowly, not surprised but sobered. She thanked Aaron and returned home with the report. She didn't share it, didn't mention it to neighbors, and didn't post anything online. She simply added the data to her folder and placed the folder in a waterproof lockbox beneath the floorboards in her pantry. Some truths weren't meant to be brandished. They were meant to be preserved, precisely for the moment someone else tried to rewrite the story. That same week, a new wrinkle emerged, not from Karen, but from the county. A formal notice of environmental investigation was mailed to properties within 500 feet of the contaminated trench. It was generic in tone, designed for neutrality, but it meant something far more significant. The scope of the issue was expanding. Not only would Karen now be on file as a subject of scrutiny, but so would the entire perimeter around her land. The implications were practical and financial. Resale values would be affected. Loan appraisals would be subject to disclosure. And worst of all, for someone like Karen, perception would shift. Eliza didn't expect gratitude or alignment from her neighbors, but she noticed the subtle change almost immediately. One afternoon, as she was raking leaves near the front of her property, the woman from 2 houses down, Maria, stopped while walking her dog. She didn't offer gossip or pleasantries, just a low comment as she passed. "She's been trying to control this block since the day she moved in. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Eliza gave only a nod, but it landed. Others started to wave when they hadn't before. Cars slowed instead of speeding past. An unspoken network of eyes began forming. Not allies, not friends, but witnesses. And sometimes that was all someone needed. It was at the end of that week that Karen finally broke the silence. Eliza was pruning a row of tomatoes near the side fence when she heard the deliberate opening of a side gate. She glanced up and saw Karen walking along the edge of her own property, hands clasped behind her back, expression unreadable. When their eyes met, Karen didn't sneer, didn't smile. She simply paused and said in a voice as even as glass, "You've made things complicated." Eliza stood up slowly, dusting dirt from her gloves. "No more complicated than they were when you called the county." Karen tilted her head slightly. "I never put your name on anything." "You didn't need to." A long pause passed between them. Then Karen spoke again, softer. "I take pride in my lawn. Always have. It's about discipline, standards, not personal." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "You poured commercial-grade herbicide into a shared water system. I treated my property, and it bled into mine." Karen didn't reply. She turned slowly and walked away. Eliza didn't follow her. She didn't need to. That wasn't an apology. That was a warning, dressed as detachment. And in that moment, she understood something else. Karen was not only afraid of losing control, she was afraid of exposure. People like her didn't fear confrontation. They feared accountability. The midpoint had arrived, not with fireworks or lawsuits, but with a single line. "You've made things complicated." It wasn't just an admission. It was a shift. Karen had acknowledged that Eliza wasn't passive, that she wasn't going to fold, that she could and would go the distance, and Eliza knew she was just getting started. The following week unfolded with an almost eerie calm, but it wasn't peace. It was tactical silence, the kind that suggested preparation rather than surrender. Eliza had seen this kind of pause before, not in neighborhoods, but in boardrooms and legal meetings back when she worked as a compliance officer for a regulatory firm that dealt in land use and environmental contracts. She remembered that silence wasn't always passive. It was often a tool, sharpened and honed, meant to lull or disarm before the next strike. Karen's expression during their brief exchange at the fence hadn't been defeated. It had been calculating. Something cold held just behind the eyes, not quite restrained, but not unleashed either, and Eliza knew better than to mistake that for retreat. People like Karen didn't back off. They recalibrated. The first sign came 2 days later. A new truck pulled into Karen's driveway, bearing the branding of a local construction and grading company. 2 men stepped out, surveyed the backyard for over an hour, and marked off a rectangular section at the rear end of the Karen's lot near the runoff trench. They didn't speak to Eliza, but one of them paused long enough to notice her watching from her own property line. She didn't wave or look away. She just memorized the name on his clipboard and the partial license plate of the truck. That evening, she ran a search through the county permits database. Nothing had been filed under Karen's name in the last 30 days, but Eliza knew from experience that some site evaluations didn't require permits if they were classified as soil amendment or grading preparation. And that's exactly what she suspected this was. A move to reconfigure or mask the source of contamination before the next round of county testing. But the real move came on Friday. A certified envelope arrived, this one not from Karen's attorney, but from the city's residential zoning and enforcement office. It cited a formal neighborhood petition submitted by 3 property owners alleging that Eliza's chicken coop, though previously approved, was now attracting pests and contributing to localized air quality degradation. The petition, complete with the signatures and time-stamped statements, was being used to initiate a zoning reevaluation. If upheld, Eliza would be required to dismantle the coop and relocate any livestock out of the area until a new approval could be granted, a process that could take up to 60 days. Eliza sat at her table and read the language carefully. She recognized one of the signatures, a neighbor who had never spoken to her before. Another signature appeared to belong to a seasonal property owner who hadn't even been in town for months. The third was smudged, nearly illegible but enough for bureaucratic motion. The implication was clear. Karen had finally escalated beyond the shadows. She was now leveraging city policy to wear Eliza down not through argument, but through exhaustion by process. But Eliza had no intention of folding. The next morning, she packed up her file folder, slid her growing documentation box into the back of her truck, and drove straight to her legal contact downtown. She met with the same counsel who had issued the earlier reply to Karen's cease and desist. This time, she laid out everything: soil tests, dated logs, photo evidence, the full correspondence trail, and the newest zoning petition. Her attorney, a woman named Leslie, reviewed each page with methodical care, then leaned back and let out a low exhale. "They're shifting the frame," she said. "You've got them boxed in on the environmental front, so now they're going for nuisance violations, something more subjective, harder to defend by raw data." Eliza nodded. "Can we stop it? We can delay it, and we can challenge the validity of the signatures. If we can prove one is fraudulent, the whole petition collapses procedurally. But that will take a motion, and motions need a hearing. Then we go to the hearing." Leslie smiled, a faint, steely expression. Most people would have folded by now. I'm not most people. By the end of the day, a formal motion to contest the petition had been filed. Leslie also contacted the seasonal property owner by certified mail, requesting a sworn affidavit confirming or denying their involvement in the document. If they denied signing it, the accusation of forgery would move from suspicion to evidence. Meanwhile, Eliza contacted the Department of Agriculture and requested a secondary verification inspection, this time not for the coop itself, but for general sanitation and pest control standards. It was a move Karen likely hadn't expected. The inspection would produce a second set of results from a different department, results that, if clean, could be presented as contradicting the petition's central claim. The inspector arrived 4 days later, unannounced but expected. Eliza greeted him with records, logs, and photographs. He walked the coop perimeter, examined the feed bins, checked the fencing, and reviewed the waste disposal method. He made a few notes, then said plainly, "There's no pest attractant here. You clean more than most farms I've seen." Eliza smiled faintly, thanked him, and requested a copy of his final report. He nodded. "I'll email you the preliminary findings tonight. The final will take a few days." That evening, just after sunset, Eliza received an unexpected call. It was the seasonal property owner listed in the petition. His voice was tense but cooperative. "I don't know what's going on over there, but I didn't sign any petition. I haven't been in town since spring." Eliza thanked him and gently asked if he'd be willing to submit a signed letter stating that. He agreed. She scanned and sent the template Leslie had prepared, and within 24 hours it was signed, notarized, and in Eliza's inbox. The forgery was now official. Leslie filed an addendum to the zoning hearing motion, requesting a full dismissal of the petition based on fraudulent documentation and potential misconduct. The motion included the notarized affidavit, along with the inspector's preliminary report stating no evidence of pest issues. It was a brutal 1-2 punch, one legal, one factual. The hearing, now officially scheduled for the following week, would likely never occur. But Eliza prepared anyway. She printed packets for the review board, 3-hole punched and tabbed by subject: zoning compliance, environmental impact, sanitation inspection, resident affidavit. No emotion, no editorializing, just facts. And while Eliza worked, Karen acted. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, contractors returned to Karen's property. This time they came with large plastic sheets and began tearing up the sod near the trench. They scraped away the top layer of soil, replaced it with imported fill, and rolled out a new turf layer. From a distance it looked like nothing had changed. But Eliza saw the pattern. She took photos of the soil before and after the replacement, noting the presence of tagged bags labeled soil mix from a commercial distributor in another county. She checked the distributor online. The product was marked non-certified for residential vegetable growth. That meant it was decorative, not restorative. It masked damage. It didn't fix it. On the day of the hearing, Leslie called Eliza early. The city pulled the petition. It's over. No hearing. They've opened a review into the signature discrepancy. Eliza let out a slow breath. No smile. Just silence. Leslie continued. They won't sanction her, but it goes in her file. And if she tries again, it'll be reviewed differently. That afternoon, Eliza received an email from the Department of Environmental Oversight. The follow-up test on the runoff trench had shown a reduction in contaminants, but still above baseline for safe residential standards. The remediation Karen had attempted hadn't solved the problem. It had merely diluted it. A formal citation would now be issued, and the property would be placed under conditional monitoring for 12 months. Karen would be required to submit a soil management plan and disclose the citation in any future transfer of the property. Eliza walked outside at dusk and looked across the fence. Karen was out front, standing by her trash bins, phone in hand. Her movements were slow, robotic. No more of the tight control she had once maintained. For the first time since their conflict began, she looked small. Not defeated, but diminished, like a building with its facade removed, all scaffolding and wire exposed. Eliza didn't feel triumph. She felt relief, and beneath it, something firmer. Resolve. The escalation hadn't ended in shouting or confrontation. It had ended in documentation, truth, and patience, and that made it permanent. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the city pulled the hearing, and in that time, Eliza had allowed herself to reestablish her routines. She returned to her garden with focus, kept her records meticulous, and resumed the rhythm of quiet mornings with the hens, the kind of life that once felt basic, but now carried the weight of a hard-won right. The house felt still again, but not with passivity, more like the silence that follows a closed door. Yet even as things around her settled into form, Eliza knew the story was not finished. Something hung in the air, not dread, but that dense awareness one develops when every breath still checks the wind for shifts. Karen had grown quieter since the citation and environmental supervision were put into place. Her landscaping crew no longer showed up. Her sprinklers, once precisely timed, now sputtered unevenly in the mornings. The light that used to glow blue through her blinds at night, some sort of home surveillance system, had gone dark. Even her dog, once the most finely groomed Labrador Eliza had ever seen, no longer barked with the same disciplined urgency. The house next door had begun to sag at the edges, not physically but socially. Its presentation cracked first, and now, slowly, its hold on image followed. But image was never the last card people like Karen played. It happened early on a Wednesday, not loud, not fast, but efficient. A city vehicle pulled up across the street, not to Eliza's property but to Karen's. 2 plainclothes municipal officials stepped out and met a third man already waiting by the side gate. They didn't knock. They entered the backyard directly, clipboards in hand, not bothering with pleasantries. Eliza didn't move from her kitchen window. She watched as one of the officials took water samples near the trench. Another collected surface soil near the shed where Karen had previously installed lawn treatment equipment, and the third opened a small digital device that buzzed and blinked. Probably logging ambient chemical levels. It wasn't the first time the city had sent inspectors, but this time felt different. Quieter, more exact. The kind of visit that doesn't confirm complaints but builds a case. And Eliza hadn't filed this one. That alone told her everything. Someone else had. It could have been a neighbor tired of the smell that still lingered faintly after hot days, or perhaps a property investor looking to pre-qualify parcels before a district expansion. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the scrutiny was no longer coming from her. The house next door had developed its own gravity now. Karen emerged 20 minutes into the visit, wearing a dark blazer, no makeup, hair drawn tightly into a bun that looked rushed. She didn't shout or argue. She stood with arms folded at the back corner of her patio and watched them work, expression unreadable. But Eliza noticed something in her posture. Fatigue. Not the performative kind people wear for sympathy, but the deeper kind that comes from months of being outmaneuvered in a system designed to respond slowly but record everything. Eliza didn't go outside, didn't speak, didn't even let herself smile. She simply watched, knowing that her part in this was complete. And yet it was that absence, her lack of engagement, that made what happened next hit with such velocity. 2 days later, on Friday morning, Eliza found a yellow envelope taped to her front door. No stamp, no courier tag, just her name written in pen. Inside was a printed flyer, the kind used in neighborhood watch groups or community events, except this one was titled "The Unseen Threat Behind Your Fence." It was 8 pages long, single-spaced, with no author name, no citations. It listed so-called unregulated poultry diseases, fabricated statistics about airborne pathogens, and included distorted photos of hens in poor condition that weren't hers, taken from online articles years old. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it look official, but it was digital sewage, lies dressed as outreach. Eliza stood silently on her porch and reread it. Then she walked to the recycling bin and dropped the entire envelope inside. It didn't warrant rage or even a reply. It warranted only documentation. She took photos, scanned the flyer, added it to her record log, and noted the absence of any formal postmark. She suspected Karen had printed and distributed it herself, perhaps to others. But Eliza didn't ask around. She didn't need allies. She needed truth, and truth moved with its own clock. That afternoon, the final environmental report arrived in her inbox. It was extensive, 43 pages including maps, soil data, photos, and recorded trends over a 90-day span. The conclusion was undeniable. Though the most recent soil tests showed reduced levels of banned chemicals, residual contamination remained in the sublayer near the trench and on Karen's property. The recommendation was clear. The affected section be designated a Class 3 restricted zone under the county's environmental code, requiring mandated bioremediation, quarterly monitoring, and legal disclosure on any attempt to sell the parcel. In short, Karen's lawn had officially become a toxic site. Eliza read the report 3 times and then printed 2 copies. One she placed in her records. The other she delivered in person to the Department of Residential Oversight, requesting confirmation of receipt. She left the building with no ceremony, no need to retell the story. It was now a matter of record. That night, Eliza heard shouting, not from Karen, but from someone else. A male voice, frustrated, sharp. She glanced out her window and saw a man standing on Karen's lawn, gesturing toward the side yard. He was holding papers. His car, parked at an angle across the driveway, had the emblem of a real estate agency on the door. Karen stood at the threshold of her house, arms crossed, face blank. The man's voice rose again. He pointed toward the yard, then toward the house, then to the street. Whatever deal they had been discussing, whatever attempt to quietly cut losses and sell, was falling apart. Eliza turned off her porch light and let the night close in around her house. She didn't sleep right away, but not from anxiety. Her mind was still quiet, not spinning, just processing. Not the events, not the fallout, but the simple fact that she had done everything within the system. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't retaliated with noise or social spectacle. She had simply documented, reported, persisted. And in that persistence, she had brought a hidden truth to light. The next morning, as she refilled the hen's water trough, she saw Karen again. This time, not outside, not manicured, not performing. Just inside her kitchen, across the fence, looking out. For a moment, their eyes met. Karen didn't scowl. She didn't blink. She just looked at her. And Eliza saw something else there. No longer arrogance or calculation. Just vacancy. The kind that sets in when someone finally realizes their facade was only ever held up by fear and illusion. Eliza turned back to her chickens, scattered a fresh line of feed, and let the morning take over. The sun was higher now, and for the first time in months she could feel the full warmth of it on her back. By the time July settled fully into the valley, the days grew heavier with heat, and the sounds of high summer returned to the neighborhood. Mowers in the distance, the brief hiss of sprinklers during the permitted morning hours, children yelling far. Off, but never close. Eliza moved slower in the heat, but her mind had begun to quiet, not with fatigue, but with something closer to conclusion. The property next door no longer carried tension. It carried weight. The once pristine symmetry of Karen's yard had begun to falter, edges browned at the seams, the topiary along the side fence left untrimmed, and the house itself showing hints of disrepair, paint around the window casings beginning to peel. Nothing dramatic, nothing ruinous, but real. It was what happened when the energy that held up a facade was redirected into damage control. Karen had not attempted another complaint, nor had she delivered more flyers. She had remained inside, curtains drawn most days, her movements visible only by the flicker of indoor lights in the evening, or the occasional glimpse of her car pulling out before sunrise and returning long after dark. The neighborhood, once dictated by her rhythms, had adapted in her absence. Neighbors resumed casual greetings across driveways, conversations returned to porches, and nobody asked questions out loud. But they didn't need to. The story had passed through the quiet network that existed in all tightly wound communities, the one that didn't rely on confrontation but on shared observation, quiet nods, and the absence of denial. Eliza never celebrated the outcome. There was no vindication in watching someone unravel, no satisfaction in confirming suspicions at the cost of someone else's stability. But what she did feel, undeniably, was clarity. The kind that comes only after walking every step yourself and knowing there was no shortcut, no unseen hand that saved you. She had been tested, not just in endurance, but in how she chose to respond to injustice that wore the face of legality, and to hostility that hid behind paperwork and misused civic process. And in every step, she had stayed grounded in facts, in patience, in restraint. That alone, she realized, was the real triumph. A month after the final citation was posted online and entered into the public property records, Karen listed her house for sale. There was no announcement, no open house, no "for sale" sign on the lawn, just a quiet listing that appeared on a local site with a neutral photo of the property, angled to crop out the trench and avoid showing the affected zone. Eliza found it by chance, not through search, but through a friend at the agriculture office who called and said, "Looks like she's trying to leave it all behind." Eliza didn't reply right away. There wasn't anything to say. The listing remained up for nearly 6 weeks, untouched, the price slowly dropping in discrete increments. Eventually, a disclaimer was added in small print: "Environmental compliance monitoring in progress. Documentation available upon request." That addition was likely required by the county, but the moment it appeared, the price dropped again. Eliza printed the listing and added it to the back of her file folder. Not out of spite. For record keeping. On the day Karen moved out, Eliza stayed indoors. She heard the soft hydraulic sigh of the moving truck's ramp, the occasional thud of furniture being loaded. She didn't watch from the window. She didn't need to. Just before the truck pulled away, there was a knock at her door. She opened it slowly. Karen stood on the porch, no sunglasses, no clipboard, just a woman in a plain shirt and loose jeans, hair tied back, keys in hand. She didn't step closer. She didn't look defiant. If anything, she looked empty. "I won't be here anymore," Karen said quietly. Eliza nodded. "I know you think I got what I deserved." Eliza replied after a moment. "I think you got what the facts required." Karen blinked once, then exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to fight back the way you did." "I didn't fight," Eliza said. "I stood where I was and refused to move." They looked at each other for a long second. No resolution. Just truth. Karen nodded once, turned, and left. The truck pulled away 5 minutes later. No fanfare, no farewell. Eliza didn't tell anyone. The neighborhood would notice soon enough. That evening, as dusk settled in, she walked the edge of her property, just as she had every night since spring. The trench was now dry. The hens were quiet.